A Thing in the Woods. Chapter 17. My father had a pile of books in the back seat as we drove home. I didn't have the nerve to grab the stack and look through them, but I did manage to glance back a few times, catching bits and pieces of words on the spines of the books. I didn't know most of those words, but I did recognize part of one: psychology. Even at my tender young age, I knew what that word meant. It was how they dealt with crazy people. So I came to the conclusion that my father had spent his time at the library trying to figure out how to deal with me. I pictured straitjackets and padded rooms. I pictured myself screaming at the top of my lungs as the intruders laughed and poked at me in the darkness. Usually, I look back at my childhood fondly. Sometimes I envy the kids that I see on the street and their ability to experience fun and joy in a way that I'm not sure any adult ever can. Blissful ignorance. However, there is a flip side to that ignorance. There comes an age when you realize that the world is far more complex than you understand, and there are so many things that are just beyond your grasp. Back then, I knew that there were things that my parents weren't telling me. I knew that they were having conversations about me behind my back. I knew that while they were trying to figure out how to understand me and deal with me, they weren't yet at a point where they could listen to me and take what I said at face value. Kids are irrational. Kids are scared of imaginary monsters. Kids throw tantrums and don't know how to find the words to say the things that they want to say. But I wasn't a kid. I wasn't an adult yet, but I wasn't a kid. So I was stuck somewhere in between, on the verge of knowing what those words on my father's books meant and still not knowing. I'm an adult now. My view of the world has changed, and I can look back at my parents a little bit differently, though I still feel the pain and loneliness of that little boy at times. The library isn't exactly how I remembered it. The basics are the same with the bricks and the wood floors, but I don't see it as a former bank anymore. I see it as a general store. There were probably advertisements on display in the front window, with corseted women drinking Coca-Cola from old-fashioned bottles or some such thing. The place looks small to me now, and there aren't many people inside. It is a place that is struggling to exist in a world that doesn't feel a need for it anymore. Looking around the library's first floor, I can remember browsing for books and talking with friends. I can see the section where Mike and I had what would be our final conversation. Outside, I can hear kids laughing and playing, and I wonder if they even come to places like this anymore. Or do kids these days only do podcasts and ebooks? On the walls, there are pictures that I don't remember ever looking at before. They're a collection of old photos and rustic artwork from the town's past. Images of what Huxley looked like back when it was founded, and back when its young men were headed off to fight world wars, and when their equally young men came home from Vietnam. In the library, I'm surrounded by the town's history. I think that I could get lost in it if I had enough time. I don't, though. I'm here to piece together my own past, not the town's. I approached the librarian at the front counter. He was absorbed in his own work when I walked up, so he didn't notice me at first. He's a young guy, probably about my age. I looked closely, trying to make some sort of connection with the past and see if I had known this person at some point. But I don't think so. When he looked up and saw me, there was a brief moment when he looked surprised, as though he wasn't used to seeing anyone in the library. Then he asked if he could help me. I told him that I was looking for any information he had on the 2 dead children that were found near the river. His eyes narrowed when he heard this, and he replied by asking, "Cold case or paranormal?" Then, seeing that I was confused by this question, he clarified, "Your book, or documentary. The only people who ever want to see those files are usually working on one of those, sometimes a college paper." I nodded, cleared my throat, and said, "I'm the kid who found the bodies." His face went blank, and he said, "Oh." I moved away shortly after that, and I never got any idea what happened with the story, I said. The librarian, whose name tag said M-, which I took to be some sort of geeky joke and not his real name, told me that nothing happened with the story. He repeated what I'd read online about the bodies being buried and a crowd showing up for the funeral as a way of honoring the unknown children. Then I asked if I could see some of the local newspapers from the time, and watched as he tried to hold back a cringe. Apparently, the library was undergoing some repairs and organization, so the old newspapers were buried in the back of the basement. He clearly did not want to go fishing through them, but agreed to do it anyway. While I waited for him to find those newspapers, I decided to go upstairs to the section of the library which had always been so mysterious to me. The mystery is gone now. They're just books. Many of them are old and worn. Some look as though nobody has ever opened them. To one side of the second floor, there are tables set up for working. I remember my father sitting at one of those tables with a few books open in front of him and a pad of paper in which he scribbled notes. He loved this place. Honestly, if I still lived here, I think I'd like it too. The atmosphere draws you in a way that modern libraries don't. I wandered up and down the aisles, looking at cover art and all the different types of books, until I came to the section on nonfiction religion, myths, and folklore. There, I ran my fingers across the spines of the books on that shelf. I finally came to a stop at a book entitled The Myth of the Supernatural, Exploring the Realm of Parapsychology by Dr. Raymond Harper. The memory of my father's books in the back seat flashed through my mind when I saw the word parapsychology. I grabbed the book off of the shelf and looked it over. It was one of those moments in life where a childhood memory suddenly shifts into an entirely new perspective and changes the way you view the past. I'm not sure how that change will ripple through my memories of the past, but it does change something. I took the book, along with a few others, from the shelf and over to one of the tables. I started going through them, taking notes as I went, just like my father. According to Dr. Harper, experiences with the supernatural can be caused by extremely emotional life events, such as psychological trauma or even puberty. This can make it hard to explore such events because the subject can be irrational. Florence Knight wrote in her book Tapestry of Silver, A Look Beyond the Veil, the spirits of the dead seek to communicate because they need closure before moving on. Often, they will find a kindred spirit with which to communicate, and such a person should do their best to help find that closure. Whereas paranormal researcher Mark McKellar wrote in his book that people looking for a human connection in the paranormal will often leave themselves vulnerable to the influence of negative forces. Clearly, there is no true consensus when it comes to researching the strange and unusual things that happen in this world. I don't know what I believe. I've had a long time to process the things that happened to me, and I still don't know what any of it was. All I know is that when it was happening, I was more scared than I have ever been in my life. Despite the voices and the laughs that I heard back then, I don't think that I ever thought of the things in my room as anything other than intruders. Whatever they were, and wherever they came from, they didn't belong here. Beyond that, it didn't matter what they were. I don't know how much time I spent flipping through those books, but I could hear traffic beginning to pick up in the library. People were speaking in whispered voices as they browsed, but I was so absorbed in my own reading that I barely noticed them. A while later, M- came up the stairs holding what looked like a giant thick scrapbook and placed it on the table in front of me. This book contained all of the local papers' issues from around the time when the bodies were discovered. I opened the book and began to flip through its pages, which had the actual newspaper glued to them. The modern world has spoiled me. I expect to be able to type in a quick search and get a fast answer, so the task of skimming through page after page of useless newspaper articles felt daunting. I knew the rough time frame for when I'd found the body, though not the exact date, so I narrowed my search pretty quickly. Then I turned each page, glancing at the headlines, eliminating what felt like far too many articles for a local paper in a town this size. Then I turned a page and came face to face with myself, or rather, a school picture of me, under the headline, Local Boy Makes Gruesome Discovery. For a moment, I just sat there, looking at the picture in shock. I'd looked up articles about the bodies online from other news sources, but this was the first time that I'd seen the report from Huxley, and my first time discovering that the newspaper had actually named me in their article. I read through the article looking for any new information that it might hold, but since it was the first report, the reporter had probably known less about the discovery than I did. The article theorized that the body, singular as the second body hadn't yet been discovered, had been buried near the river. The victim could not be identified, but sources close to the case suggested that investigators were working under the assumption of murder until an autopsy could confirm the cause of death. I sat back in my chair and looked at my own picture once again. So this reporter had written a story about a potential child killer and had chosen to publish the name and photo of the child who had uncovered the crime. The more I thought about that, the more irritated I became. I can only imagine how my parents must have reacted upon seeing that article and to know that I had possibly been placed in the path of a murderer. It seems unfathomable to me, and I don't know why the reporter would do such a thing. I'd almost expect to see that level of reporting from one of the big-name news outlets, but I'd always thought of small-town press as being more concerned about the locals. Nothing came of that report, of course. I'm happy to confirm that I was not tracked down by any serial killers. But if this were happening now and my child were the one being pointed out in the press, I would have been terrified. As it turns out, my parents had their own story taking place back then, just as Lucy did. I guess the reporter had one too, and the detectives, and the other kids and parents in town. I always think of those days as my story, with all of it happening to me, alone and isolated. Now I see that my story was just one part of something much bigger. I snapped a photo of that article with my phone and continued to flip through pages of newspaper. I stopped when I found the page that I remembered seeing in the police station. On that page, I saw the sketches of the two children whose bodies were discovered. They were the same sketches as before, but the kids looked so much younger to me now. Their whole lives had been taken from them. I looked at the sketch of the little boy, drawn to look alive and vibrant. Then I thought about the hand that I saw, covered in mud and pointing toward the sky. There are countless stories that surround this event in this town, but as I sit and look at those faces, I realize that the most important stories of all, the ones that deserve to be told and remembered, are the stories of those two kids, the ones who never had a chance to tell their stories for themselves. I snapped a picture of that article as well, and continued flipping through the pages. There were other articles relating to the bodies that were discovered, about their funeral, and the end of the search in the field. Eventually, the story faded from the pages of the newspaper because there was simply nothing left to report. I don't know what I expected to find in the local newspaper. If anything major had happened, I'm sure that the larger news outlets would have covered it, and I would have seen those reports online. Still, I've always felt a need to come back to this place in search of closure. I always felt that by being here, breathing this air and walking these streets, I would be able to understand the things that had never made sense to me. As it turns out, there was one last piece of this puzzle waiting for me at the library. I don't know how much it helps to explain things, but it does bring back some memories of how things ended for me in Huxley. Things I'd forgotten. It happened as I was leaving the library. I walked down the stairs and past the front desk, waving to M- as I went. As I neared the exit, one of those old historical pictures on the wall caught my eye. The picture was an old American folk art painting, created by a local man named Walter Daniels in the late 19th century. The painting depicted a field, with small hills and woods in the background. In the picture, there were two small children, a boy and a girl. They were standing, looking straight ahead at me, with blank expressions on their faces. The girl had a basket of apples, fallen and spilled near her feet. The boy was wearing a bright blue shirt. In the trees behind them, there was a dark figure, hidden in the shadows. This figure vaguely looked like a woman hunched over, but there wasn't enough detail to say for sure. The figure was watching those two children. I pulled out my cell phone and opened the photo that I'd taken of the newspaper upstairs. After zooming in on the sketch of the two children that were found in the mud, I held my phone up to the painting and compared the images. They looked the same. The clothes looked the same. The hair looked the same. They were the right ages. The painting wasn't done in great detail, so it would be impossible to match the faces exactly, but in broad terms, the children were identical. It made no sense. The painting was created well over a century before I found the body in the mud. Any bodies that had been out there for so long would have been reduced to bone fragments. It was insane to make the connection, and yet I was finding it hard to ignore. The frame of the painting had an engraved tag attached at the bottom. The tag revealed the name of the painting, Whispers in the Night.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.